Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 20th of January, and in today's video we're going to be talking about the recent Russian advances that occurred in southern Avdiivka that include the capture of several fortified Ukrainian strongholds that have been built up really in some instances over the past 10 years. In today's video we're not going to be talking about Russian advances that occurred in four other parts of the front line. I'm going to save that for the next video, because in today's video I want to do a tactical breakdown of the Ukrainian and Russian sides within this particular battle, and I also want to give some context to this most recent round of Russian attacks. So we're going to begin by looking at some of the background, and throughout early January the intensity of the fighting around Avdiivka really did get reduced, with less ground maneuvers by the Russian side and artillery strikes really on both sides reported, and many parts of the front line were completely quiet. I can say for certainty, because I covered this pretty extensively, that the areas on the flanks of Avdiivka, they saw a drastic reduction in the amount of fighting, especially when it comes to armored assaults and infantry-based assaults. You can see the same thing about the fighting on the northern flank of Avdiivka in January, and same thing for the southern outskirts, where now we're seeing the Russian advances. The one area where we did see an increase, which albeit it was a pretty small increase in assaults, but we did see an uptick, was in the area just on the northern outskirts of the village or of the city of Avdiivka. We could see that there were some Russian attacks that occurred on the rural dachas just to the north of the residential areas of Avdiivka and just to the south of Kamyanka in some cases. We're going to look at that later on in the video. Now, a lot of this lull in early January could be explained by the weather, specifically looking at the second week of January from the 8th of January to around the 14th, which I'm now showing you on this forecast. Here you can see the dip in temperatures, with sometimes the highs being around 0 degrees Celsius and the lows being at a minimum negative 14 degrees Celsius at this point over here on the 13th. And so this was really the status quo for about a week in terms of the temperature around Avdiivka. You could see that by the 14th going into the 15th, the temperature started to rise, and ever since, so from the 15th to the 20th now, we've had the new normal be around a low of 0 degrees Celsius to 6 degrees Celsius at maximum. And when we look at the 1 week period before the 15th of January, you'll see that it was largely defined by overcast clouds, and there was also a certain amount of precipitation. Really, there were very few sunny days throughout that entire period. Now, during the same time period, we also saw the wind speeds really going above 5 kilometers an hour in many different instances, and that has sort of stayed the same. It's actually increased in wind speed in the week since going into the present day, but nonetheless the amount of precipitation has drastically declined. Now we're seeing some more sunny days, and there's still a lot of overcast days, but for the most part the temperature has gone up during that time. So now the weather is more conducive for military operations, because really during that initial period of January, the bad temperature and the high amount of snow did cause issues on both sides, by the way, with the mobility of troops and vehicles, the reliability of electronic warfare systems, and of course drones. And that's really a key point that I want to hone in on. And there had really been a very extended and very fierce period of fighting that occurred in December, in particular in early December, around Avdiivka on the southern outskirts as well, but throughout the entire city. And so both sides had been engaged in this really fierce battle with a high amount of casualties throughout that month of December. So going to the January period, there was sort of this mutual sort of policy that was carried out by both sides, where they reduced their amount of ground maneuvers and started to reorganize their forces, rotate some units. In the case of the Russian forces, we saw more regular troop rotations, as the Russians, especially around the Avdiivka area, due to the Donetsk conglomerates and their ability to use resources from the DPR, they were able to conduct more regular operational rotations in the Avdiivka sector. Now, during this period of time where there was a lull in the fighting, the Russian forces did have an opportunity to organize the artillery in preparation for the assault. It had an opportunity to move additional forces and resources to the front line through their rail and road systems that connect throughout Donetsk Oblast, especially in the city of Donetsk, which is relatively close to Avdiivka. And at the same time, the Ukrainians lacked the full benefit of one of their key assets, which is drones. drones are really the primary method by which the Ukrainians are able to gather reconnaissance about the Russian forces. I'm not saying there aren't any other ways, but I'm saying that the Ukrainians really have relied on that to get an idea of where and when the Russians are concentrating forces. And so during this period of time, before the 15th of January, it was really difficult for the Ukrainians to get drones in the air, especially on Avdiivka, where there were several days, several like large periods of time where it was extremely foggy or there was precipitation, which hindered the ability of those drones to get a full idea of the scope of the Russian plans for an assault. And that likely played a role in the Russians having an initial edge when they launched their initial assaults on the Ukrainian forward lines, which started around the 16th of January going into the 17th. So looking at where the Russians advanced, really the gains started to materialize during the 17th of January with one of the main axes of attack being from the industrial district and the dachas that the Russians had captured throughout November and December in southern Avdiivka. And they used the heights on which those positions are located because remember, a big reason why the Russian forces advanced along this road, Yasnovitsky Lane, and cleared out these Ukrainian fortified areas is because they are located on a local hill that overlooks the Ukrainian positions that are located further north within the residential sections of Avdiivka. And in terms of the elevation of the Ukrainian positions that are just further to the west, that I'm going to mark in blue right now, they are in rather similar elevation. And so the Russian forces, they are now using these positions on these heights to flank the current Ukrainian positions that are located in forested areas and in some smaller dachas and trenches that were set up in the area to the east of the Tsarska Ohota fortification system. So Tsarska Ohota is located over here. It's one of Ukraine's most prized possessions in its entire southern sector of Avdiivka, as it is an area with several cottages that is sort of a lodging point for the Ukrainians. But even more important are the trenches that are built around it. And so one of the areas where the Ukrainians were holding on to in order to protect the flanks of that fortification system was this area over here, this small village. It's called Skotovata, as you can see on the map. And you can see that there are some houses over here where the Ukrainians have been located ever since they were pushed back from the dachas located over here in that larger village. And as you can see, even when I zoom in, you can see the extent of the trenches from Google Maps that the Ukrainians have built up over these past 10 years. And now for a moment, you can see the Petrenko map. So this is a pro-Ukrainian map, but they do show the fortification system. So I really appreciate that. And I'm leaving their link in the description. As you can see, a lot of these trench systems are built in the backyards and the fields around these houses. And this is an area that the Ukrainians had been using to hold out from numerous Russian attempts at pressure from the rail line directly to the south and from the east for several months. But due to the element of surprise that I mentioned before and due to the extent of the Russian assaults, and we're going to get more into the reasons, regardless of them, the Russian forces were able to gain a foothold within these villages, these dachas, getting control of some of those trenches, and the rest of this stronghold being turned into a gray zone as the Ukrainians were pushed back into the forested areas around Tsarska Ohota, into the trenches on which that area is located. So as this assault was going on, starting on the 17th, led by the 15th Pianashka Battalion of the 110th Motor Rifle Brigade, so a DPR unit, and armored support from the 10th Tank Regiment of the 6th Motor Rifle Regiment, or Division, sorry. We also saw the Russians launch a new attack axis around the 18th or 19th of January towards Tsarska Ohota directly. So the previous Russian position could be seen in this orange color, and then have this reddish sort of color that indicates more recent Russian advances. And so you can see that previously the Russian forces, they had their front line around this rail line, and they had a sort of bridgehead established past it in some of the rail stations and the trenches that were built up by the Ukrainians that the Russians had captured. And they used those forward positions as a springboard to advance along the same road and take over the adjacent trench systems. And most of the trench systems are located to the south of Tsarska Ohota. And so the Russians spent the past 2 days clearing those positions out. And it's just come out now, actually, a couple of hours ago, according to Deep States. And by the way, in terms of my mapping, I'm basing a lot of it off of Deep States, as there's not a lot of geolocated footage. But I do trust the veracity of Deep States, especially as they are a pro-Ukrainian source with a large Ukrainian following. They're now saying that the Russian forces have control over the cottages of the Tsarska Ohota fortification system. And so looking at the wider picture, this new Russian vector of attack, it leaves the Ukrainian forces that remain within the forested area to the south of the residential sections of Avdiivka in danger. As you can see right here, they are in this sort of salient where they're being enveloped on three sides. And at the same time, you can see that by the Russians putting pressure on this salient, that the salient where the Ukrainian positions are located further south are also in jeopardy. Now, the Ukrainians in this position over here in this abandoned air defense base, they are holding very strong. So I'm not saying it's about to fall, but I am saying that by virtue of the Russian advances to the northeast, there is additional pressure being put on supply lines and on the forces in general that are being stationed over here. And they really have to hand it to them to a certain extent because they have been able to hold on to this position despite being enveloped on three sides, despite the Russian advantage in firepower targeting this fortification system. And it is a big reason why the Russians were not able to advance along the T-0505 road directly into the residential districts of Avdiivka so far. But that's why we're seeing the Russians advancing through this new vector of attack directly into the southern outskirts of the city. Now, presumably during the nighttime, during some of these most recent days, the Russian forces have also sent DRGs in order to gauge the extent of the Ukrainian defense in terms of their manpower, but also in terms of the fortifications that they've built up. And so there were reports from the Russian side of DRGs that were operating in the southern residential districts of Avdiivka around this blue marking over here, and also within the Chimik district, residential district of Avdiivka, where you do have a lot of high-rise apartment buildings. This is an area that the Ukrainians are certainly going to invest resources in if they haven't already, because you have many high-rises that are perfect positions for overlooking the entirety of the valley of the city of Avdiivka itself. And so it makes sense that the Russians would want to send DRGs into the direction in order to gauge the extent of those defenses. But in terms of a permanent advance by the Russians, that has not been claimed really by any of those sources. And so for now, it's just a Russian reconnaissance operation. And just as one last tidbit, we do have information on the unit that's leading the attack on Tsarska Ochota. Of course, there are other units that I've marked on my map. One of them that is leading the assault is Bars 11, a volunteer unit that's been moved into this direction, I believe from the Kherson front several months ago. And this video has not been geolocated yet, but it's claimed to be from this area, so wait for the geolocation, obviously. But what they say here is that it's showing the drone that shows the Russian infantry actually clearing out the Ukrainian trench that is located likely around the Tsarska Ochota axis. Now, in this portion of the video, I really want to discuss some of the factors that allowed Russia to make this most recent advance, which is really important, because if you were to compare the changes on a daily basis on the front line around here, you never see anything on this extent in this part of the front line. And I understand that when you look at this polygon, for instance, and you can see that it is very small in just plain looking at it in absolute terms, but in relative terms, when you compare it to the previous several months, years, really, it is an advance of note. And so I do want to look into why this has changed in terms of the front line. And so when you look at reports from Deep State, for instance, and from Ukrainian military blogger Yuri Butusov, because I'm just going to use some of what they said and just bring in some of my own analysis into here, they mentioned in particular that during this most recent round of assaults, the extent of the Russian units was simply too large for the Ukrainian defenders to carry. They cannot handle that many assaults by that many forces with that much of armored support, for instance. And so there were gaps in Ukraine's defense that were quickly spotted and they were taken advantage of, and that did force, in certain instances, the Ukrainians to pull back to other parts of the front line. And when I say pull back, I'm not talking about any sort of major withdrawal. I'm talking about withdrawals from one trench to another. So again, several hundred meters, because that's the scale at which we're talking about in this part of the front line. Now, these complaints about a lack of reinforcements, especially in the southern part of Avdiivka, are extremely widespread within the Ukrainian sphere when talking about this battle. And that's despite the fact that I talked about in November, especially, the Ukrainians moving in 5 brigades, or at least elements of those units, to Avdiivka, not particularly to the south, but to the city in total. And so a lot of those units were committed to the northern flank of Avdiivka, and they were successful in that regard because they were able to halt the Russian advance where it's currently been around the eastern outskirts of Stepova for a while. And that's been in large part due to the fact that reserves have been moved in from other areas, like around the Velika Novosilka axis, the Orkiv sector. So that certainly played a role, but due to the Ukrainian emphasis on the northern flank, there really hasn't been much left to be sent to defend the southern district. And that's an area where the Ukrainians clearly were not expecting the main Russian vector of attack to come from. And so that explains the lack of manpower that we're looking at. Really, the only units that's defending over here, or the main one, is the 110th Mechanized Brigade. They are aided by some smaller drone units and some special units from the National Guard, but that's the full extent. And they've been holding over here, and I'm referring to the 110th, for several months now, with very little in terms of manpower or reinforcements coming in. They may have had a small boost during the lull period, but that's really about it. And they've been fighting on this part of the front line during very intense parts of the fighting, starting in October and then also hitting a climax in December and now hitting a new climax in late January. Now, looking at a more localized reason, which I mentioned previously, the fact that for a couple of days the drones were not able to get clear picture of the front line of the Russian positions. It did give the Russians a slight advantage when it comes to organizing their forces and equipment closer to the front line and launching that initial assault, for which the Ukrainians would have been more prepared for if they had a full idea of where and when the Russians were going to attack. Now, another massive issue that's mentioned on the Ukrainian side is in regards to artillery specifically. The Ukrainians, they are short on artillery in general, and we've seen a steep decline in the amount of artillery outputs that's been coming out of them compared to the summer period when they were engaged in the counteroffensive. So they really did expend a lot of their shells during that counteroffensive in order to maintain the amount of advances that they were able to afford, or the amount of attacks that they could launch on areas in Zaporozhye Oblast. And that really ate away at a lot of the stockpiles that the Ukrainians had. And at a certain point, the Ukrainians really were forced to, first of all, decrease the results in the counteroffensive and end it completely, and then also reduce their amount of artillery outputs, lest they not have any left in a year's time or in 2 years' time, just looking into the long term. And now we're seeing some of the ramifications of that artillery rationing. And in some cases, there's really no other choice as there's not much artillery left. So now in terms of the shells that the Ukrainians are firing on a daily basis, it's reported to be around 2,000 a day, which is down from several thousand more during its climax in the counteroffensive. And the Russian forces are now reaching around 10,000 shells per day. So it's about a 5-to-1 advantage. And that may actually be higher in terms of the artillery advantage in certain parts of the front line. For instance, in southern Avdiivka, where the Russian forces, they do have, again, a large accumulation of artillery batteries around the city of Donetsk that they can afford to fire into Avdiivka. And as I was saying before, a lot of the Ukrainian artillery resources were focused on the flanks of Avdiivka, where you did see a lot of the assaults by the Russians in October. And so now there's going to have to be conversation the Ukrainians have about redirecting those resources towards holding back the Russian assaults in the southeastern corner of Avdiivka. And again, this isn't to say that the Ukrainians don't have any capabilities in terms of artillery. I'm not saying that. I keep track of videos of Ukrainian artillery strikes on Russian troop accumulations and on vehicles on other parts of the front line. But I'm just saying, as somebody who's been looking at the videos from Avdiivka, there has been a relatively small amount. And even if there are periods of success, it would not be enough to fully stop any sort of Russian organization of attack. And that's what we're seeing the effects of now. Another issue that I've noticed is in regards to the defensive structure that the Ukrainians have built up in this region. Of course, you have to give them a huge amount of credit for building up this region over the course of 10 years. And that's one of the main reasons why the Russians have been unable consistently throughout that period in the Donbass war, but also since the beginning of the war in February 2022, to break through in this area. Even looking at when they intensified assaults in October, they really did hit a dead end in some of these areas when it comes to these assaults because of those fortifications. But when you look at the layers of fortifications, you wonder about why the Ukrainians did not have a large amount of mines that were present in these areas in the industrial district of Avdiivka, for instance, and now looking at the forested areas where the Russians are currently advancing. Those mines, they are extremely important. They were extremely important during the period of time in the southern counteroffensive, where the Russian forces had a significant mining operation in the areas to the north of the Surovikin line, which played a big role in holding back a lot of Ukraine's armored assaults, mechanized attacks they were launching. and you just don't see that same amount of like resources being put in and dispersed widely throughout the Avdiivka sector. Now, of course, I'm aware of the fact that there's been a lot of mines placed on the flanks of Avdiivka, for instance, around Severine, and also to a certain extent around the area to the west of Krasnohorivka. To be fair, that is all fair. But then in terms of Avdiivka directly, we've simply not seen the same amount of resources being put in. And you can say the same thing about ATGM crews as well. We've not seen as many ATGM crews engaging with Russian armor as they've been advancing along the main road through the industrial district. That was a big thing when in October, November, the Russian forces were first attacking in this area. You did not see as much engagement by these crews, and they did not have the proper mobility to engage with those Russian forces, which allowed the tanks and the infantry fighting vehicles to clear the way for more infantry to make it in and coalesce control of those areas. And it's likely we're seeing something very similar occur now as the Russians are launching their attacks with Bars 11 through the Tsarska Hota area. Now, looking at the logistics for the Ukrainian side, you could see that they do still have many routes through which they could send forces for rotation and for resupply, moving them in and out. That's clearly shown here with the main and secondary supply routes that are categorized on my map in the yellow and green colors. And then for the most part, it is not a critical situation in terms of the logistics. It may be more difficult for supplying certain areas that are more isolated, like this abandoned air defense facility. For the most part, you do have supplies. The issue is when it comes to the Russians targeting them as they advance along this road. You still do, of course, have precision missile strikes on some of those Ukrainian supply routes. You do have a lot of shelling of this region. So those are factors that hinder the full transfer of equipment, which is extremely necessary during this period of time. And then on the flip side, on the Russian side, you do have very small amounts of Ukrainian long-range missile strikes or just cruise missile strikes, ballistic missile strikes at the Russian rear in this region. So in terms of logistics, they're not really threatened in this region. And that is important because Donetsk has a train station, of course. It has a bunch of roads that are interconnecting. It is a massive junction where you unload and reload supplies and forces through. And it is extremely close to the Russian assaults that are now ongoing in Avdiivka. So they do have this cable that's providing them with additional resources continuously for their fights around Avdiivka. And we've simply not seen the Ukrainians able to hinder them effectively as of yet. Now looking at the drone section of this analysis, the Ukrainians, they are of course relying a lot on these cheaper civilian-made originally FPV drones that they've been turning into drones that could be attached with explosives that attack equipment, attack dugouts, trenches, infantry, individual soldiers. That's all true. There's plenty of those videos that are actually marked on my map in the geolocation section that you can see at the bottom over here. And that gives us an idea of the Ukrainians being able to hold a line using those drones. A lot of the Russian casualties are caused by such drones. But you also have to look at the flip side where the Russians have really since the summer, but even before that, significantly increased their own production of FPV drones. And it's gotten to a point where even the commander of the Ukrainian Achilles unit, which is associated with the 92nd Brigade, I believe it's their artillery reconnaissance units of the 92nd Brigade. So the head of that unit, he's now saying that in critical parts of the front line, the Russians have a 5 to 7 times advantage in comparison to the Ukrainian side when it comes to the utilization of FPV drones. And that was stated in early December. So again, that's in critical parts of the front line, as he stated. He didn't specifically say Avdiivka, but likely Avdiivka is included in that. Now, of course, the ratio of Russian to Ukrainian drones might be different in other parts of the front line, but within an area like Avdiivka, it is very important to keep that in mind, where you do have the Pseudoplatov unit working. That is a Russian drone unit that's also been releasing a large amount of compilations of drone strikes on the Ukrainian side, including at day and also during the nighttime. And so you're seeing also an approval of those drone technologies. And just remember, it's not just FPV drones that the Russians have and also the Ukrainians, but you're looking at quadcopters and on the Russian side, also Lancet drones. Now, despite everything I've said, the Ukrainians definitely have the capabilities, just as they've had in every single other urban battle that I've covered throughout this war. If you go back to Mariupol, but a more apt comparison would be the Battle of Bakhmut. The Ukrainians do have the capability to drag out the fighting over here for many, many months. And that's due to the fact that even if they don't have the full amount of reserves that they would like, they do still have the ability to send in some reinforcements, as we saw in November. And those reinforcements do have the ability to hold the line in highly fortified areas on the outskirts of the city for a long period of time. And now that we're seeing those outskirts being slowly taken by the Russians, we have the city itself where battles haven't really started yet. And a lot of those houses are going to be turned into strongholds. We're going to see house to house fighting in a lot of those sections. And then, of course, you have the elephant in the room, the Avdiivka coke plant, where you do have a large tunnel system, basements, fortified areas, firing positions. So that all has to be kept in mind. And as I said before, the Chimik district, this is an area with a lot of high-rise apartment buildings. And so in that regard, the Ukrainians definitely do have the ability to hold out over here for a protracted period of time. Really, the question is, what's the cost benefits of doing that? How many men will be lost in holding out to certain portions of the city, and how many would be saved by withdrawing out of them? That's something that we don't have the specifics about. But now, before I end the video, I do want to briefly mention some of the other movements that occurred around the Avdiivka front, not in the south, but in other parts of the city over the past 5 days. We have here this video which shows a LMUR missile. So this is an air-to-surface missile, a guided missile that's fired from helicopters, hits the Donetsk filtration plants. This gives us confirmation that the Ukrainians do still have control over this key facility that's been being used by the Ukrainians as a forward operating node to prevent deeper Russian attacks past the highway and towards the eastern outskirts of Avdiivka. So you do see tenacious Ukrainian resistance over there. Here's an area that's pretty interesting. This is an area that's been reported by Deep State as under Russian control as of today, 20th of January. And this is an area where we've seen rather small Russian advances, but as I told you guys, the Russians since the early January have been increasing pressure on the northern outskirts of Avdiivka. So now it appears they've been doing that just to the south of Kamyanka in the direction of some of these rural dachas. And of course, as I said before, the Russian forces are increasing pressure just to the east of the coke plants. There's no reports of Russian advances, but it is noted by the Russian side, Russian sources like Rybar, that they are trying to increase the pressure in this direction. Now, going further south, we'll look at Pervomaiska. There is an indication of an advance by the Russian forces that started around the 16th of January, and we got confirmation of that on the 18th of January. This video which shows what appears to be a Russian sapper who clears a Ukrainian trench, in Pervomaiska, which does indicate to us that there was a slight advance of a couple hundred meters through the main road running through that village. So there was also Russian pressure that started around Pervomaiska at the same time that the Russians began their attacks in southern Avdiivka. And the same thing can be said about Nevelske, where also around the 16th of January, we saw the Russian infantry, or actually the Russian vehicles, beginning their attacks on Ukrainian fortified structures. There were several key Ukrainian fortified structures in the area to the east of Nevelske, which is, again, a forward operating node for the Ukrainians, held by the 59th Motorized Brigade. So some of those include this area over here. So this is an area where you had Russian tanks and infantry fighting vehicles engaging the Ukrainian positions, followed by Russian infantry being moved into the front line and clearing out tree lines where you had Ukrainian dugouts, as is proven by this geolocation over here, which does indicate that there was a slight Russian advance throughout that specific field. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.